St. Mary's General Hospital stands as a beacon of excellence in a quiet, affluent suburb, its glass exterior shimmering in the morning light. The hospital is a picture of prestige, gleaming floors, bright lights, and a staff that moves with the efficiency and precision one would expect from such a respected institution. Families gather in the waiting area, hushed whispers blending with the sound of medical equipment. The atmosphere is calm yet charged, as if the walls themselves hold untold stories of both triumph and struggle. Today is a special day for Angela Parker. She steps through the sliding glass doors, taking in the sight of the pristine lobby. Angela, a young black nurse in her late 20s, wears her new uniform proudly. Her eyes reflect a mix of nerves and excitement. She pauses for a moment, letting the reality of her new position sink in. It's a huge step forward in her career, one she's worked tirelessly to achieve. A brief memory flashes in her mind, a moment with her mother in their cozy kitchen back home. The scent of coffee fills the air as her mother, a strong woman with lines of wisdom etched into her face, holds Angela's hands gently across the table. "Baby girl," her mother had said, voice filled with both pride and concern, "you're going to have to fight twice as hard as everyone else. But you've got the strength of all the women who came before you. Remember where you come from and don't ever let them see you doubt yourself." Angela's smile fades for a moment as she recalls those words, but only briefly. She takes a deep breath, straightens her posture, and steps forward with renewed determination. Today is the beginning of something new, something she's dreamed of for years. She knows it won't be easy, but she's ready for whatever comes her way. The hospital buzzes with morning activity as Angela approaches the nurses' station for the first time. She can feel the eyes of her new colleagues on her, assessing her as she enters. The conversations that were lively just moments ago suddenly quiet down. The glances are subtle but noticeable, darting away quickly when she looks in their direction. Angela offers a polite smile, trying to ease the tension, but it's met with a cool, distant nod from the nurses already gathered there. "Hi, I'm Angela Parker," she introduces herself confidently, extending her hand. "I'm the new nurse starting today." The head nurse, a woman in her 40s with a stern expression softened only by the hint of a smile, looks up from her clipboard. Her eyes flicker with something Angela can't quite place. Surprise, perhaps, or skepticism. Still, she puts on a polite front. "Welcome, Miss Parker," she says curtly. "I hope you're ready. It's a busy day and we don't slow down for anyone." Angela nods, keeping her voice steady. "I'm ready." As she walks down the bustling hallway, Angela takes in the sights and sounds of her new workplace. Doctors rush by, deep in conversation about patients. Nurses chart vitals, the rhythmic beeping of monitors providing a constant backdrop. Angela doesn't let the cool reception faze her. She's experienced this before, the subtle coldness, the quiet resistance. She tells herself it's just the usual nerves and unfamiliarity that come with being the new face. But there's a nagging feeling in the back of her mind, a whisper reminding her that it might be more than just first-day jitters. Angela heads towards the staff room to grab her first set of patient charts. Her steps are confident, but inside, she's bracing herself. She thinks back to her long nights in nursing school, the hours spent studying while her classmates went out. She remembers the moments when she was questioned more harshly than others, the times when her success was met with raised eyebrows instead of congratulations. Yet through it all, she persevered, driven by the belief that she was meant to be here, to help people in their most vulnerable moments. "Keep your head up," she whispers to herself, echoing her mother's advice. "You've got this." The narrator's voice cuts in, addressing the audience directly. Before we dive deeper into Angela's journey, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. Have you ever faced a challenging first day at a new job? If you're ready for an inspiring story filled with unexpected twists and moments of resilience, make sure you hit that subscribe button and join us for the rest of this emotional ride. Angela makes her way back to the nurses' station, feeling a mix of anticipation and unease. The atmosphere has shifted slightly, as if the hospital itself is holding its breath, waiting to see what comes next. She steps into her new role with hope, unaware of the silent storm brewing beneath the surface, hidden behind the hospital's polished facade. Today will be the first of many tests, and Angela is determined not to let anything, or anyone, dull her spirit. Little does she know, this day will be the beginning of a journey far more challenging and transformative than she could ever imagine. Angela's first morning at St. Mary's General Hospital started with a brisk pace, the kind she had expected at a top-tier institution. But it didn't take long for the reality of the work environment to seep through the polished exterior. As she made her way down the hall, carrying a stack of patient charts, she noticed how the conversations around her would abruptly fall silent. Groups of nurses, who had been laughing just moments before, turned serious as she approached, their eyes darting away when she looked in their direction. Angela felt a knot form in her stomach. This wasn't unfamiliar to her. It was the same subtle chill she had felt before, in places where she was the only one who looked like her. She pushed the feeling down, telling herself it was just the awkwardness of being new. But as the morning wore on, the small slights became harder to ignore. At the nurse's station, Angela waited patiently as a blonde nurse, busy with a clipboard, pretended not to see her. She stood there for what felt like an eternity before clearing her throat softly. "Excuse me, I'm looking for the charts for room 205, Angela said with a polite smile. The blonde nurse glanced up briefly, her eyes flicking over Angela before looking back down at her clipboard with a slight smirk. "Oh, those have already been assigned. But I have something else for you." She handed over a different set of charts, her tone dripping with a kind of condescending politeness. "You'll be handling Mr. Johnson in room 303. He's a bit difficult." Angela took the charts without protest, even though she knew what was happening. Mr. Johnson was known among the staff for his outbursts. Patients like him were usually assigned to the more experienced nurses. This wasn't about skill, it was about setting her up to fail. She thanked the nurse anyway, maintaining her professionalism, and walked away with the charts clutched tightly in her hands. As she made her way down the hall, she couldn't help but overhear snippets of conversations behind her. "Did you see the new hire?" one voice whispered. "I don't know why they thought she'd fit in here," another replied. The words stung, but Angela kept her head held high. She had dealt with this before. It was nothing new, but it didn't hurt any less. Midway through the morning, Angela's routine was interrupted by a deep, commanding voice. "Nurse Parker, I presume?" Angela looked up to see a tall, older man in a crisp white lab coat standing before her. His hair was a distinguished salt and pepper, and he wore the kind of stern expression that came from years of authority. This was Dr. William Greaves, the senior doctor she had heard about. "Yes, I'm Angela Parker," she replied, offering a warm smile and extending her hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you." Dr. Greaves looked at her hand for a brief moment before ignoring it completely, his eyes cold and assessing. "I hope you're ready to work hard here, Miss Parker. We don't tolerate anything less than excellence at St. Mary's." Angela nodded, lowering her hand slowly. "I understand, Doctor. I'm here to do my best." "Good," he said curtly. "Then you can start by taking over Mrs. Thompson's case in room 204. She's post-op and her condition is complicated. I trust you're up for it?" Angela hesitated for a moment. Mrs. Thompson was another notoriously difficult patient, one that most new nurses wouldn't handle without direct supervision. But she could see the challenge in Dr. Greaves' eyes, the way he was testing her. She squared her shoulders and nodded. "Of course, Doctor. I'll take care of it." As she turned away, she heard him mutter under his breath, "We'll see about that." The weight of the extra workload began to set in quickly. Angela found herself running from room to room, handling difficult cases while her colleagues took on easier tasks. It was becoming painfully clear that she was being assigned the most challenging patients on purpose. Every time she looked up, she noticed the other nurses whispering to each other, throwing her sympathetic yet skeptical glances, as if they were waiting for her to break. But Angela wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. She took a moment to lean against the wall, closing her eyes for a second as exhaustion began to creep in. In that brief moment, a memory surfaced, a flashback to her childhood, sitting at the kitchen table with her mother. The room was filled with the smell of freshly baked bread, and her mother's voice was warm and soothing. "You're going to face people who will try to put you down, Angela," her mother had said, gently tucking a stray curl behind Angela's ear. "But you've got something they don't have, you've got the strength of our entire family behind you. And no matter what, you don't let them see you falter." Angela opened her eyes, drawing strength from the memory. She took a deep breath and straightened her back, feeling a renewed sense of determination. She couldn't let them see her doubt herself, not now, not ever. Returning to her rounds, she entered Mrs. Thompson's room, bracing herself for what she knew would be a challenging encounter. As she worked, maintaining her professionalism despite the patient's complaints, Angela became aware of someone watching her. She glanced over and noticed a patient in the next bed, an older man with a calm, observant gaze. He was dressed in a hospital gown, but there was something different about him, something that didn't fit the usual image of a patient. "Good morning," Angela said, offering him a kind smile as she finished adjusting Mrs. Thompson's "I'm Nurse Parker. How are you feeling today?" The man nodded slightly, his expression thoughtful. "I'm doing well, Nurse Parker," he replied. His voice was steady, and there was an air of quiet authority about him. "You seem to be handling things quite well for your first day." Angela was taken aback for a moment. There was no hint of the skepticism she had seen from others, only a genuine interest. She smiled, feeling a flicker of warmth in the otherwise cold atmosphere. "Thank you," she said. "I'm just trying to do my best." The man continued to watch her with a calm, assessing gaze, as if he were studying her reactions. It made Angela feel slightly uneasy, but there was also something comforting about his presence. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than met the eye, but she didn't have time to ponder it. The call light from another patient's room was already buzzing, pulling her back into the rhythm of her hectic day. As she left the room, she glanced back one last time at the man, who gave her a small, knowing nod. His eyes seemed to hold a secret, a depth of understanding that Angela couldn't quite place. But for now she had other things to worry about. The rest of the day passed in a blur of endless tasks, whispered comments, and the heavy weight of being constantly watched and judged. By the time her shift ended, Angela was physically and emotionally drained. She gathered her things from her locker, the words of her colleagues still echoing in her mind. "Do you think she'll last?" one nurse whispered. "I doubt it," another replied. "This place isn't exactly made for people like her." Angela's hands tightened into fists as she took a deep breath, fighting back the tears threatening to spill. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break down. Instead, she whispered her mother's words under her breath once more. "Keep your head up, Angela. You've got this." As she walked out of the hospital, the sky was turning a deep shade of purple, the sun dipping below the horizon. Angela took a deep breath of the cool evening air, feeling a small sense of relief wash over her. But she knew that this was just the beginning. The real battles were yet to come, and she'd need every ounce of strength she had to face them. In the distance, the lights of the hospital glowed brightly, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. Angela squared her shoulders and started walking towards the bus stop, unaware that she was being watched once again, this time by the same man who had observed her so closely earlier that day. Mr. Thomas Edwards remained silent, but his gaze was thoughtful, almost contemplative, as if he were piecing together a puzzle no one else could see. Angela's shift dragged on, filled with the same cold stares and dismissive remarks that had become her daily reality at St. Mary's. The weight of the day seemed heavier than usual. It was as if the walls themselves were pressing in on her, reminding her of her outsider status. Every interaction felt like a test, every task another way for her colleagues to watch and judge, waiting for her to falter. By mid-afternoon, Angela found herself assigned yet another challenging patient, an elderly man with dementia who had become increasingly agitated. She spent nearly an hour calming him down, enduring his confused outbursts while a few nurses peeked into the room, whispering amongst themselves. As she left, she heard one of them mutter, "She's only getting the difficult cases. They're setting her up to fail." Angela clenched her teeth, fighting back the urge to confront them. It was as though every task she was given was designed to push her limits, to make her question her own abilities. Dr. Greaves, ever watchful, seemed to take a special pleasure in assigning her the most complex patients, always with a thinly veiled smirk. His words from earlier in the week echoed in her mind, "We'll see how long you last here." It was nearing the end of her shift when she encountered him again, this time at the nurse's station. He stood there with a stack of charts, his expression stern. "Nurse Parker," he called, his voice louder than necessary. The other nurses turned to watch, a few of them exchanging knowing looks. "Yes, doctor?" Angela kept her tone polite, refusing to show any sign of the exhaustion she felt. "These patients need immediate attention," Dr. Greaves said, thrusting the charts into her hands. "I trust you can handle it, considering your expertise." The pause before the last word was deliberate, a jab meant to remind her that she was being tested. Angela met his gaze evenly, despite the burn of humiliation spreading through her chest. "Of course, doctor," she replied. "I'll take care of it." As she turned away, she felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Instead, she forced herself to breathe deeply, clutching the charts like a lifeline. She finished her rounds with a robotic precision, her mind a storm of frustration and sadness. By the time her shift ended, she felt utterly drained, her spirit chipped away piece by piece. When she finally stepped outside, the sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The cool evening air brushed against her face, but it did little to soothe the ache in her chest. She usually drove to work, but tonight she needed time to think, time to process everything she had been through. Without a second thought, she headed toward the bus stop. Angela boarded the bus, finding a seat near the back. The bus was nearly empty, save for a few passengers scattered throughout. She leaned her head against the window, watching the city lights blur past, her reflection staring back at her with tired, sad eyes. The steady hum of the engine and the rhythmic bumps of the road should have been comforting, but tonight they only magnified the hollow feeling inside her. It was the first time since starting at St. Mary's that she allowed herself to truly feel the weight of it all. The microaggressions, the dismissive comments, the isolation. It was as if she had been holding her breath for weeks, trying to keep herself from breaking under the pressure. But now, in the dim light of the bus, there was no one to perform for, no one to judge her. She could finally let herself feel the anger, the sadness, the sheer exhaustion that had been building up inside her. Tears welled up in her eyes and she wiped them away quickly, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. She pulled her bag onto her lap, searching for something, anything to occupy her hands and her mind. Her fingers brushed against a small notepad she kept for jotting down reminders, and without thinking, she pulled it out along with a pen. Angela stared at the blank page for a moment, her pen hovering above it. Then, almost unconsciously, she began to write. The words flowed out of her in a rush, a torrent of everything she had held back, her frustration, her sadness, her anger. She wrote about the way her colleagues looked at her, the whispered comments she pretended not to hear, the way Dr. Greaves seemed determined to make her life as difficult as possible. She wrote about the constant pressure to prove herself, the feeling of never being good enough, no matter how hard she worked. "I'm exhausted," she scribbled, her handwriting shaky. "I'm fighting a battle I didn't ask for. Every day I walk into that hospital, I have to brace myself for what's coming. It's like I'm not even a person to them, just an inconvenience they're waiting to get rid of." The pen moved faster now, tears spilling onto the page as she wrote about the isolation, the loneliness of being the only one who looked like her, the only one who seemed to notice the undercurrent of prejudice in every interaction. She wrote about her mother's words, the strength she tried to hold on to, even when it felt like she was being crushed under the weight of it all. "I don't know who will read this," she wrote at the end. "But I needed to tell someone. I needed someone to know that this is happening. That it's not okay." Angela stared down at the note, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the reality of what she had written sank in. It was raw and unfiltered, a window into her soul she hadn't meant to open. She felt vulnerable, exposed, but also a strange sense of relief, as if putting it all on paper had lifted a small part of the burden from her shoulders. The bus slowed to a stop near her neighborhood. Angela folded the note carefully, hesitating for a moment before tucking it between the seat and the wall. Her fingers lingered on the edge of the paper, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew it was foolish to leave it behind, knew that nothing would come of it. But she also knew that she couldn't keep carrying all of this inside her. It was a small, desperate plea for help, a cry into the void she doubted anyone would hear. With a deep breath, she stood up and stepped off the bus, the cool night air hitting her face as she walked away. As the bus pulled away, she looked back one last time, feeling a strange mix of fear and hope. Part of her regretted leaving the note. What if it fell into the wrong hands? But another part of her, a small but growing part, hoped that someone would find it. Someone who might understand. Angela walked home in silence, her mind still buzzing with the events of the day. The sky above her was clear, the stars faintly visible through the city's glow. She felt empty and full at the same time, like she had given a piece of herself away but hadn't quite figured out what that meant yet. As she turned the corner towards her street, the bus continued on its route, the folded note fluttering slightly in its place, waiting to be discovered. The bus continued its route through the quiet streets, the folded note wedged between the seat and the wall, fluttering slightly with each jolt. A few stops later, a middle-aged woman named Carol boarded the bus, taking the same seat where Angela had been sitting. She was returning home from a late shift, weary but alert, her eyes scanning the empty seats around her. As she settled in, something caught her attention, the small piece of paper peeking out from the crevice. Curious, Carol pulled out the note and unfolded it. The handwriting was rushed, almost frantic, and as she began to read, her expression changed from mild interest to shock. The words on the page were raw, filled with pain and desperation. Angela's plea for help, her description of the hostile work environment, and the discrimination she faced all leapt off the paper. Carol's heart sank as she read the final lines. "I don't know who will read this, but I needed to tell someone. I needed someone to know that this is happening. That it's not okay." Carol's hands trembled slightly as she held the note. She didn't know who had written it, but she could feel the distress and isolation behind the words. It was a cry for help, one she couldn't ignore. Glancing around the bus, now nearly empty, she folded the note carefully and placed it in her purse. Her mind raced with what she should do next. The writers sounded like they were in genuine distress, possibly facing severe workplace harassment. This wasn't something she could dismiss. Taking a deep breath, Carol made a decision. She would contact the police. The next morning at St. Mary's General Hospital, the usual morning bustle was interrupted by the arrival of 2 uniformed police officers. They stepped through the entrance with a sense of urgency, making their way directly to the front desk. The receptionist, a young woman with a friendly smile, immediately faltered when she saw the serious expressions on their faces. "Good morning," one of the officers began. "We received a report about a potential case of harassment and endangerment involving one of your staff members. We need to speak with the head of the hospital immediately." The receptionist's eyes widened in surprise. "I'll contact the administration right away," she stammered, picking up the phone with shaking hands. Word spread quickly through the hospital. Nurses and doctors exchanged confused glances, whispering among themselves as the police made their way to the administrative offices. Dr. Greaves, who had been reviewing patient charts at the nurses' station, looked up sharply when he noticed the commotion. His face hardened as he realized something serious was happening. Angela, who had just arrived for her shift, felt a knot form in her stomach when she saw the officers. Her mind raced. What could this be about? Her concern grew when she caught a glimpse of Dr. Greaves, his expression dark and filled with a mix of anger and worry. In the administrative office, the hospital director, a tall man with graying hair, greeted the officers with a tense smile. "How can I assist you today, officers?" One of the officers held up the crumpled note, now placed inside a clear evidence bag. "We found this note yesterday. It was left on a bus, and it details experiences of severe harassment and discrimination at this hospital. We're here to investigate the claims and ensure the safety of the staff member who wrote it." The director's face drained of color as he read the contents of the note. He quickly regained his composure, forcing a smile. "I assure you this must be a misunderstanding. We take these matters very seriously, but I'm confident there's no such issue here." Before the officer could respond, the door to the office opened, and Mr. Thomas Edwards stepped inside. He moved with a calm, authoritative presence that commanded the room's attention. The officers turned to look at him, clearly recognizing the respect he seemed to command. "Mr. Edwards," the director said, surprised. "I didn't realize you were here this morning." Mr. Edwards gave a thin smile. "I've been observing a lot of things during my stay," he replied. "It seems this investigation is well-timed." The director frowned, clearly caught off guard by Mr. Edwards' comment. "I'm not sure I understand," he said hesitantly. Mr. Edwards took a step closer, his expression shifting to one of quiet resolve. "Let me clarify then," he said. "I'm not just a patient here. I am Thomas Edwards, CEO of Healthcare United, the company that oversees St. Mary's General Hospital and several other facilities in this region." The room fell into stunned silence. The director's eyes widened in shock, and the officers exchanged a surprised glance. Mr. Edwards continued, his voice calm but firm. "I've been here for a few weeks, recovering from surgery, and I've had the opportunity to see the day-to-day operations firsthand," he said. "I've witnessed subtle but pervasive acts of discrimination, particularly towards one nurse, Angela Parker." The director stammered, clearly flustered. "Mr. Edwards, I assure you we are handling this matter." Mr. Edwards held up a hand to silence him. "No," he said sharply. "You're not handling it. In fact, the culture of this hospital has allowed this behavior to flourish unchecked. And I suspect that the person most responsible for fostering this environment is none other than Dr. Greaves." At that moment, the door swung open, and Dr. Greaves stepped inside, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice tight with anger. "Why are the police here, and why am I being implicated in this nonsense?" Mr. Edwards turned to face him, his expression cold and unyielding. "This is far from nonsense, Dr. Greaves. I've watched you demean and undermine Nurse Parker at every turn. I've seen the way you assign her the most difficult tasks, the way you belittle her in front of her colleagues. Your actions have been nothing short of discriminatory, and I won't stand for it any longer." Dr. Greaves' face turned red, a vein pulsing in his temple. "You can't be serious," he spat. "This is absurd. She's simply not qualified for this position, and I've been trying to ensure patient safety." Mr. Edwards took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "Patient safety? You jeopardized a patient's life just a few days ago with your arrogance, and it was Nurse Parker who saved the situation by speaking up, despite your attempts to silence her. Dr. Greaves' expression faltered, his eyes darting towards the officers who were now watching him intently. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The realization of the gravity of the situation began to sink in. "You've been caught, Dr. Greaves," Mr. Edwards said quietly. "Your behavior is not only unprofessional, it's illegal. The culture you've fostered here has created a toxic environment, one that goes against everything Healthcare United stands for." The silence in the room was thick, charged with tension. The director looked between Dr. Greaves and Mr. Edwards, his face pale. "Mr. Edwards," he began, "what are you suggesting we do?" Mr. Edwards turned to the police officers. "I want a full investigation into Dr. Greaves' conduct, as well as an immediate suspension pending the results. We need to set an example that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated here or anywhere else in our network." The officers nodded, stepping forward to escort Dr. Greaves out of the room. He didn't resist, his shoulders slumping in defeat as he realized the extent of the consequences he now faced. Angela, standing just outside the office, watched the scene unfold with wide eyes. Mr. Edwards caught her gaze and gave her a small, reassuring nod. It was then that she realized the full weight of what had just happened. The note she had left on the bus, the desperate plea she thought would go unanswered, had sparked a change she could never have imagined. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of hope rising within her, like a small flame flickering to life in the darkness. The tension from the morning's confrontation lingered in the air like a storm cloud refusing to dissipate. News of Dr. Greaves' suspension spread through the hospital like wildfire, reaching every corner from the bustling emergency room to the quiet administrative offices. Conversations that had once been whispered behind closed doors now bubbled to the surface, no longer restrained by the fear of retaliation. In the cafeteria, a group of nurses huddled together, their voices hushed but tinged with disbelief. "Did you hear what happened? Dr. Greaves got suspended," one of them said, eyes wide with shock. Another nurse, who had once openly dismissed Angela, leaned in closer. "I never thought I'd see the day. And it was all because of that note," she murmured, her expression a mixture of guilt and admiration. Angela walked past them, pretending not to notice the sudden shift in their demeanor. She kept her head high, even though inside she felt like she was still processing everything that had happened. The same nurses who had once ignored her were now glancing her way with what looked like respect, maybe even a hint of apology. It was a strange feeling, like stepping into a new world she hadn't expected. The announcement of Dr. Greaves' suspension came swiftly and publicly. The hospital director, standing in the main lobby with a solemn expression, addressed the gathered staff. "Effective immediately, Dr. William Greaves has been suspended pending a full investigation into his conduct," the director stated, his voice firm. "We take these matters very seriously, and we will not tolerate any form of discrimination or harassment at St. Mary's. It is our responsibility to ensure a safe and inclusive environment for all our staff and patients." There was a collective murmur among the crowd. Some staff members looked visibly relieved, while others exchanged uncertain glances, clearly still processing the seismic shift in the hospital's power dynamics. Angela stood at the back, watching the announcement unfold, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the moment she had dreamed of but never believed would actually happen. A moment of accountability, a crack in the polished facade of St. Mary's. Later that afternoon, Angela was called into Mr. Edwards' temporary office. She knocked softly on the door, feeling a mix of nervousness and anticipation. When she stepped inside, she found Mr. Edwards sitting behind a desk, looking up with a warm smile. "Nurse Parker," he greeted her, gesturing for her to sit. "Or perhaps I should say Angela, if you don't mind. I'd like to speak with you on a first-name basis." Angela nodded, taking a seat. "Of course, Mr. Edwards." He leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment. "You've been through a lot these past few weeks, and I want to start by thanking you. Your courage and resilience have brought to light issues that should have been addressed a long time ago." Angela felt a swell of emotion rise in her chest. "I didn't think anyone would take it seriously," she admitted. "I was afraid it would just be ignored like everything else." Mr. Edwards nodded thoughtfully. "I understand why you felt that way. But you made a choice to speak up, even when it was difficult, and that choice has sparked a change. It's something I've seen before in other institutions. Change rarely comes from the top down. It starts with people like you who refuse to accept the status quo." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Which is why I'd like to offer you a new role here at St. Mary's. We need someone to help guide this transformation, someone who understands what it feels like to be marginalized and ignored. I want you to be our Chief Diversity Officer. Angela's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. Chief Diversity Officer? She repeated, hardly daring to believe it. Yes, Mr. Edwards confirmed, his smile widening. I can't think of anyone more qualified. You've shown incredible strength and insight, and I believe you have the vision to help us build a truly inclusive environment here. It won't be easy and there will be resistance, but I know you're up to the challenge. For a moment, Angela was speechless. The weight of the offer, the validation of everything she had fought for, felt overwhelming. She blinked back tears, nodding slowly as she found her voice. I don't know what to say, she admitted. Thank you, Mr. Edwards. I promise I won't let you down. He stood, extending his hand to her. I'm confident you won't, he said warmly. Now, let's get started on changing this place for the better. The news of Angela's promotion spread quickly. The same staff members who had once dismissed her as inexperienced or out of place now approached her with congratulations and, in some cases, awkward apologies. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing a side of the hospital culture that many had either ignored or been complicit in perpetuating. Sarah, a nurse who had often sided with Dr. Greaves, hesitated by Angela's side as she prepared patient charts. Angela, Sarah began, her voice softer than usual. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I didn't realize how bad things were for you. I should have spoken up, but I didn't. Angela looked up, searching Sarah's face for signs of sincerity. She found it in the way Sarah's eyes shone with unshed tears, the way her hands twisted nervously in front of her. Thank you, Sarah, Angela said quietly. It means a lot to hear that. The shift in the hospital's atmosphere was palpable. Staff meetings now included discussions about inclusion and respect, topics that had once been taboo or brushed aside. Angela began to lead workshops, speaking openly about the issues she had faced and encouraging others to share their own experiences. It wasn't easy. There were still pockets of resistance, murmurs of discontent from those who preferred the old ways. But for the first time, it felt like there was real momentum for change. Angela found herself busier than ever, but it was a good kind of busy. She spent her days meeting with staff members, listening to their concerns, and developing new policies designed to create a more equitable environment. She worked closely with Mr. Edwards, who continued to support her efforts with the full backing of Healthcare United. One afternoon, as she was finishing a meeting with a group of new hires, Angela took a moment to step outside into the courtyard. The sun was shining, casting a warm glow on the benches and flower beds. She sat down, closing her eyes and letting the light wash over her face. It felt like a fresh start, like she could finally breathe again after holding her breath for so long. A familiar voice broke the silence. Enjoying a well-deserved break? Angela opened her eyes to see Mr. Edwards standing beside her, his expression one of quiet pride. She smiled up at him. Just taking a moment to appreciate how far we've come. Mr. Edwards nodded, sitting down next to her. And how far we still have to go, he added. But I believe we're on the right path, thanks to you. Angela looked out across the courtyard, watching as staff members moved about, chatting and laughing. It was a small scene, but it felt monumental, a sign that things were beginning to change for the better. Thank you for believing in me, Angela said softly. Mr. Edwards shook his head. No, Angela, he corrected gently. Thank you for giving us a reason to believe that change is possible. For the first time in a long while, Angela felt a deep, unshakable sense of hope. The battle wasn't over, but she was no longer fighting it alone. And that made all the difference. Angela's first day as Chief Diversity Officer began with a sense of anticipation she hadn't felt in a long time. She arrived early, standing outside the glass facade of St. Mary's General Hospital, the sun reflecting off the building's surface. It felt like a new beginning, one that she had never imagined possible when she first stepped through those doors. As she walked inside, the staff greeted her warmly, genuine smiles, not the polite, distant ones she was used to. It was a small change, but it spoke volumes about the shift in the hospital's culture. Her first meeting was with the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, a new group she had helped assemble. They represented different departments and backgrounds, a mix of faces she hadn't seen working together before. Angela felt a swell of pride as she looked around the room. This was what progress looked like, people from different walks of life, coming together to create something better. Thank you all for being here, Angela began, her voice steady and confident. Today marks the start of a new chapter for St. Mary's. We have a lot of work ahead of us, but I believe that together, We can make this hospital a place where everyone feels respected, valued, and safe. She outlined her vision, a series of initiatives aimed at addressing systemic issues, including mandatory diversity training, mentorship programs for underrepresented staff, and a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. The team listened intently, nodding in agreement, their faces lit with a sense of purpose. The day flew by in a whirlwind of meetings, policy drafts, and conversations with staff members who wanted to share their own experiences. Angela's heart ached as she listened to stories similar to her own. Nurses who had faced subtle biases, orderlies who had been overlooked for promotions. But there was also hope in their voices, a belief that things were finally changing, that the hospital was becoming a place where their voices mattered. That afternoon, Angela stood in the main auditorium, facing a sea of hospital staff. The room was packed with people spilling into the aisles. It was a sight she never would have imagined. Colleagues who had once ignored her now looked up at her with respect, eager to hear what she had to say. Taking a deep breath, she stepped up to the podium, her heart pounding with a mix of nerves and excitement. "Thank you all for being here," Angela began, her voice filling the room. "When I first started at St. Mary's, I felt like an outsider. I was assigned the hardest tasks, given the coldest reception, and faced challenges that had nothing to do with my abilities and everything to do with who I am. I know I'm not the only one who has felt this way. And that's why I'm here today, standing before you not as a victim but as a leader." She paused, taking in the faces of the audience. Some looked ashamed, others determined, but all of them were listening. It's not enough to say we value diversity. We have to show it in every interaction, every decision, every policy. We have to create a culture where everyone is given a fair chance to succeed, where no one has to prove their worth just to belong. And that starts today with all of us. Angela's voice softened as she continued. "I want you to know that your stories, your voices, they matter. We're not just changing policies, we're changing the way we treat each other, the way we see each other. This is a chance for us to build something better, together." The room erupted into applause, a wave of support that washed over Angela, filling her with a sense of purpose she had never felt before. It wasn't just the applause, it was the shift she felt in the air, the collective understanding that this was more than just a speech. It was a call to action, a promise for a better future. After the meeting, Angela made her way to the hospital lobby. The walls were filled with the familiar art and plaques, but something new had been added, a mural that stretched across one side of the room. It depicted a diverse group of healthcare professionals working together. Doctors, nurses, technicians, all standing side by side. The vibrant colors and detailed expressions captured the spirit of unity and collaboration, a stark contrast to the atmosphere that had once permeated the hospital. Angela stood in front of the mural, her fingers tracing the edge of the painting as she took it in. It was beautiful, but it was more than that. It was a symbol of everything they had fought for, everything she had endured. It was a reflection of the change she had helped bring about, a change that had once seemed impossible. Tears welled up in her eyes, but this time they were tears of joy. She thought back to her first day, the whispers behind her back, the cold looks from her colleagues. It all felt like a lifetime ago. She could almost hear her mother's voice, soft and proud, saying, "You did it, baby girl. You fought the good fight." Angela took a deep breath, letting the emotions wash over her. For the first time she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her journey, not just the pain but the triumph as well. She had turned her struggle into a stepping stone for change, not just for herself but for everyone who would come after her. As she turned to leave, she saw Mr. Edwards standing nearby, watching her with a smile. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he asked. Angela nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes," she whispered. "It's everything I hoped for." Mr. Edwards gave her a nod of approval. "You've done something incredible here, Angela. This is just the beginning." She smiled back at him, feeling a sense of closure but also a sense of excitement for what was to come. The work was far from over, but for the first time she felt like she wasn't fighting alone. The narrator's voice cut in, speaking directly to the audience. What part of Angela's journey resonated with you the most? Was it her perseverance in the face of discrimination, or the unexpected twist that brought justice to St. Mary's? Let us know in the comments below, and if you found this story as inspiring as we did, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of courage and hope. Angela took one last look at the mural, her heart swelling with pride. Then, with a deep breath and a confident stride, she walked away, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring, knowing she had already made a difference. The camera lingered on the mural for a moment, the vibrant colors a testament to the new spirit of the hospital. A spirit of unity, respect, and the promise of a brighter, more inclusive future.